NCAA for a while. Her specialty and research area is in NIL. So how do we pay college athletes? A very significant change in what's happening in the college athletic world. And for this season, we are trying to do our talks in places that are related to the topic of the research. So tonight is an example of that. October the 11th, you're going to hear about some research about black holes, and we'll be at the Cincinnati Observatory, this 19th century fantastic place on the east side of Cincinnati with a big telescope and one of the birthplaces of astronomy. So it's going to be a fun season. Hope you're with us all through April, and we'll wrap up. But it's a special night to be here on a game night at the Reds in this spectacular season. Two things, we're going to have questions at the end. If you're in the audience live in person, just raise your hand. If you are among our friends joining us virtually, you'll see a Q&A function at the bottom of the screen. Just type your question in that, and we will watch for them and ask them when the time comes. To welcome us a little more here to the baseball park and to the Hall of Fame is Jack White, who is one of the owners of the Reds and also a professor at Chase and directs the Center for Entrepreneurship and has been a bit of an entrepreneur himself. So he's teaching with some practical knowledge. So Jack, if you would.
Thank you. This evening is arguably unique and special in this sense, and I'll suggest it to you. History is meeting history in the context of sports. Tan has become an expert, as will be manifested in a few minutes, in the subject of NIL. And NIL is arguably and if you don't agree, we can debate it, but it's arguably the most significant development in amateur sports in U.S. history. And it rivals, and it might be, you might say it's about the same as what happened 50 years ago, the year that Billie Jean King equalized women's pay within professional tennis, and the year that Title IX changed the world relative to gender in college athletics. And now NIL has come along and has been disruptive, some good, some bad, and we'll learn more about that. The history with which NIL and Tan's expertise will intersect is, of course, the history of the Reds embodied in this facility. And just to remind some of you, in case you don't know or don't remember, the Reds started in 1869, 154 years ago, and was and is the first professional baseball team ever. It also did something historic in 1888 by being the first and only team to ever be expelled from the league. And the reason for that expulsion was the Reds served beer to the fans. So someone's agreeing with me. Notable event. The Reds made history in 1935 by being the first ballpark to turn on lights at night. And of course, a little more history with the double world championships in 75, 76, orchestrated by the Big Red Machine, followed by 1988, when interestingly, 35 years and 2 days ago, Tom Browning threw a perfect game here at the ballpark, September 16th, 1988, and it was the 13th perfect game ever in baseball history at a point in time that there were 3,025 potential opportunities for a perfect game to be thrown. So there's some interesting history associated with the Reds, and there's very interesting history relative to the work that Tan's doing, of which she and the university are particularly proud. So she's about to walk up and discuss NIL, and we can make our own judgment when she's finished about our views of it, after which we'll then spend 13 minutes taking a look at Reds history in a film. After that, tour the Hall of Fame or go to the ballpark. And as to current events, we were just told that the Reds have 11 games to go. That's right. And we're a half game behind in the wild card hunt. So we're at a point now that every game counts, which means this one tonight counts. So if you're able, cheer a little louder than normal. But first, let's cheer for the star of the show, Tan Boston.
Well, thank you. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And I also would like to thank Jack and Mark for those amazing introductions, and the Reds in particular for allowing me to present here this evening. This is an amazing venue, and I hope that you all will stay afterwards to tour the Hall of Fame if you haven't already done that, and especially to attend the game and cheer the Reds on. So thank you. You've heard previously, I'm a professor. I'm a relatively new professor at Chase. So this is my second go around at Chase. I started as a visitor in the 21, 22, and now I'm back again. So I'm really excited to be back and to be here with you, talking about one of my favorite topics, NIL. So we're going to just jump right into the presentation. And of course, I'm a professor, so I'm going to have some questions for you. So just get ready for that. All right. So no presentation would be complete without an overview, right? So we'll talk about definitions, right? Some of you in the audience may not be as familiar with NIL, so we'll start off at a basic level. Then I will describe the reinvention, or, the renaissance that's going on in college sports at this moment. I'll summarize the state laws that kind of guide us through what's happening and what we're seeing. And then lastly, we'll talk about the various different controversies that involve NIL. All right. So I'm starting off with a question. And so you see that on the screen. True or, there's my question. True or false?
Yeah.
Let me get it off first. NIL is the acronym for Now It's Legal, as college athletes may now engage in commercial activities that previously violated NCAA rules. Anyone?
False.
Okay, let's see. Yes, you're right. False. NIL stands for name, image, likeness. And so you'll hear me refer to it as NIL, NIL, name, image, likeness. I'm referring to the same thing all three times. So let's jump right into it. So NIL is defined as an activity that involves the use of a student athlete or an individual's name, image, or likeness for commercial or promotional purposes. This is groundbreaking because, as I'm sure you know, the NCAA was founded on amateurism. Until recently, college athletes were not able to profit off of their names, images, and likenesses. But we saw that change, and I will show you a timeline of how that happened a little bit later in the presentation. But first, I think it's important to know what we mean and what we don't mean by NIL. First and foremost, it's not meant to be used as a recruiting inducement, right? But we know that some things are happening that kind of go against that prohibition. We also know that it's not supposed to be pay for athletic performance. But again, we're seeing some different things out in the wild that might state otherwise. Most of the time, student athletes are seen more prominently promoting their names, images, and likenesses on social media. So that's where you will see the vast majority of student athletes able to profit. Appearances, they're of course making appearances, signing autographs. We can just remember just a few years back, various different scandals regarding signing autographs by student athletes, licensing contracts. So they're able to go into contracts with Nike and all of the various different apparel companies. They're able to give lessons under their own names. I'm sure you guys are familiar with, the camps that pop up during the summer. Student athletes are now able to have camps under their own names and provide lessons under their own names. And that was something that had been previously prohibited as well. So now that we know what NIL is, now I'm going to talk a little bit about how it works. And so this next slide is not exactly how it works, because everyone, as you know, is not going to be able to profit from NIL at the same level as some of the headlines that you're seeing. But this is such a controversial topic at this time that it's currently being debated in Congress, and we're going to talk about this a little bit later. So we will come back to the federal legislation that is, has been proposed in various different formats. There's quite a few bills that have been proposed, and we'll talk about that a bit later. But now I just want to give you guys a foundation of knowledge about how NIL is working. First, we have the typical sort of NIL deal, or what was envisioned by the NCAA when they allowed this scenario to go forward. Initially, it was thought that student athletes would contact, various different either companies or individuals in order to, promote themselves. And so that's how it was envisioned. It was envisioned that, schools wouldn't be involved, and boosters especially would not be involved. It would be student athlete initiated. So that's what I mean by self-facilitated NIL. Then we've got the school deals, right? So we know that early on in the NIL landscape, there was BYU that had a booster that was providing NIL funds for walk-ons, essentially the whole football team. And that wasn't what was originally intended, but now we're at a place where we've got these collectives now that have developed, and that's the third-party situation that you'll see mentioned. In addition to the collectives, and a collective is essentially a combination of fans, boosters, alumni that have all pooled their resources together to support NIL activities for student athletes at a particular school. So Cincy Reigns is a collective for the University of Cincinnati, and there are over 100 across the country associated with various different schools and athletics departments. And so a booster, as you know, is a supporter of an athletics program. Phil Knight is one of the more famous ones at Oregon. And so those are just the three different ways that we are seeing NIL kind of display itself since the NCAA has changed its rules. One thing that I didn't mention is that the exchanges. I'm not sure how much you guys know about the exchanges, but there's essentially, I think of them as, dating sites for NIL. They match individuals who are looking to provide the opportunities with student athletes that are looking for opportunities. So that's how I think of Open Doors and Influencer and various different, exchange sites that are bringing together both sponsors and student athletes. So what you see on the screen now is just a comparison by sport of where the NIL funds are going. And so you can see from the screen that primarily the largest amount of NIL is going to football. And then you have men's basketball, followed by all other sports, right? So that's all of the other Olympic sports that you see in the white category. And then that's followed by women's basketball. And then that smaller slice is baseball. I thought it appropriate to include the NIL for baseball here just because, we are here. At the Red Stadium. So vast majority are going to what we call revenue generating sports, basketball and football. Not that there aren't other sports that are generating revenue on a school by school basis. So what do we see here on the screen? These are the headlines. So this is why people probably think that NIL is producing Bentleys and Benzes for everyone. I just like to mention that these larger, 7-figure deals are outliers, right? Most student athletes are not making millions or anything close to millions of dollars. But what we see in the headlines will lead us to believe that that is the case. And so I thought it was, there's lots of different controversies that we see in the news surrounding NIL. And we'll talk about all of those hopefully at the end. So I think it's important to know, how did we get here? Just 3 years ago, we were still in amateurism land where student athletes were not allowed to profit from their names, images, and likenesses. And actually, we've seen lots of scandals because of this. We've seen the autograph scandals. We've seen the memorabilia scandals. We've seen, the pool parties, the gentlemen's clubs, and all of these various different scandals that at the time were scandals. But right now, we're not so sure because we're in a different place. And so I think it's important for us to figure out, how did we get here? And that's what you see on the screen. California was the first state to pass NIL legislation in 2019, but it was not the first state to make their NIL legislation effective. And so what happened was California got the ball rolling, right? And I think the intent with the California legislature was to give the NCAA an opportunity by making their legislation effective in 2023 rather than immediately, to give the NCAA the opportunity to come up with a solution for this. But that didn't happen because, as you see on the screen, Florida jumped in and said that they were making their legislation effective July 1st of 2021. And so in effect, we've got, the states pushing the NCAA's hands on this NIL issue. And so the NCAA had lots of meetings regarding this, but they hadn't made a firm decision until after the Alston versus NCAA case that you see that was decided by the United States Supreme Court in June of 2021. And it's important to note that Alston versus NCAA was not an NIL case. It was a case involving the amount of educational benefits that could be provided to student athletes. And so in Alston versus NCAA, the Supreme Court held that schools could not limit the educational benefits, and the NCAA as well could not limit the educational benefits that they were providing to student athletes. So for example, internships, they could now, fund internships. They could provide travel, they could provide computers, everything that's connected to education that facilitates the learning or educational process. There couldn't be any limitations on those amounts. And the problem with that from the NCAA's perspective, though, is that it was an antitrust case. And with this ruling against the NCAA, it was signaling that, especially with the Kavanaugh concurrence that I'm sure you all have heard of, that perhaps some of the other payment rules that the NCAA had might be in jeopardy from an antitrust perspective. And so we see after the NCAA's loss in Alston versus NCAA, that's when we see them start to meet and vote on whether or not they're going to proceed with allowing NIL, knowing that Florida's legislation was going to become effective on July 1st. And so we see on the eve of July 1st, the NCAA Board of Governors meeting to address the NIL issue and ultimately deciding to allow it effective, surprise, July 1st, when the first NIL legislation was to become effective in the states. And so that's how we got here. It was a relatively short time ago, but we are here. Another thing that's important to point out with all of the various different controversies that we're seeing around collectives, boosters, just the destabilization that's occurring with players, kind of taking their skills and talents to various different schools, presumably based on the facilities and the coaching and the education that they're receiving there. Or maybe not. So on the path to where we are today, the NCAA has issued multiple different policies for, in particular, that first one on June 30th was regarding the vote to allow NIL. Then there was another policy that was issued in May of 2022 regarding how collectives were going to be categorized, and they were categorized as boosters. Then on October 26th of 2022, the NCAA came out with additional guidance regarding the role that schools could play in NIL and the roles that they could not play. So they've got this long list, you can provide education, but you can't provide direct payments and things of that nature. And then more recently here, we see on June 27th of this year, the NCAA came out with even more guidance regarding school involvement in NIL. And the reason for that is because, I'm not sure if you guys saw on the news, but Texas A&M, they decided to kind of go the more direct route with their collective, and they tried to kind of bring their collective in under their foundation. And so they ignored the NCAA when the NCAA said, hey, that's too cozy of a relationship between, the foundation and the collective, that's against the rules. They kind of ignored the NCAA, but then the IRS came in, right? They did not ignore the IRS. And so that organization is now defunct. Texas A&M, they're not fools. So they decided that they were not going to go that route anymore. All right. So at the present time, we only have 29 state NIL laws. And the reason for that is that several of them were repealed. Alabama led the charge in this regard. Alabama was the first state to repeal their NIL law because their particular law was a lot more restrictive than some of the others that were on the books. And once the NCAA changed its rules, they realized that they had a lot more flexibility by not having an NIL law than they would by having these rules on the books. And so we saw some other states follow in that regard. And that's why it says 32, but really it's only 29. So what are these laws essentially? So there's a common core in most of the laws of the provisions, and I have those listed here. You know, first, that student athletes can earn NIL compensation. As you know, that was prohibited by the NCAA until the first law became effective. Also, there are pronouncements in there that schools can't penalize students for exercising their NIL rights. NCAA, the conferences, there can be no penalties for students exercising those rights. Another extremely important part of this scheme is agents. As you guys know, student athletes could not retain agents, but they can for NIL purposes under these statutes. And another important thing are the disclosure provisions. And so I'm not sure how much this is occurring, but student athletes are supposed to be disclosing their NIL transactions to their schools and allowing them, you know, the opportunity to determine if there are some conflicts with the contracts that the schools have. So, for example, if a student athlete is trying to sign a deal with Adidas at a Nike school, that could pose some conflicts depending on what the responsibilities and obligations are of that athlete. There are additional provisions, and these are just, you know, all over the board, which is why there has been a call for national legislation, because some of the states are more restrictive, you know, some of them are more permissive. Some states, of course, you know, have restrictions on student athletes using school logos, facilities, uniforms, and things of that nature. Some states are, you know, actively allowing, you know, coaches and schools to be involved in facilitating these deals and, you know, acting like exchanges and matching up athletes with potential sponsors. The other things are there's, you know, restrictions on, you know, beer, cigarettes, alcohol, strip clubs, things of that nature, and entering into those types of transactions. And also some of the laws require, you know, financial literacy training. And we can see why that would be important, especially at the high end where we have, you know, the athletes that are elite in their sport and finding their way into those $1 million deals. All right, second question here. True or false? Multiple attempts to pass federal NIL legislation have been unsuccessful. That's a trick question, kind of. True. All right, let's see. Right, true. So Congress has proposed more than a dozen, and I'm sure you've seen some of those in the news recently. But unfortunately, none of them have made it through the legislative process, which, you know, we've got various different states with various different laws. As you can see, not only is it confusing for student athletes in deciding where they're going to go to school, it's also confusing if you are going to have a regulatory body like the NCAA. Essentially, they're trying to, you know, enforce their rules and then trying to keep up with the laws of the 29 now states that have NIL legislation on the books. And so there's been a tremendous call by not only the NCAA, but schools as well to have some sort of uniform standard, which brings us into our current issues, right? And so now we'll start to talk about some of the various different controversies that we're seeing surrounding NIL, and first and foremost, federal legislation, a huge call for that. Title IX issues. As you saw from the slide where I showed the various different articles about the size of the deals, you'll see on the male side, you know, deals upwards of, you know, some in the tens of millions of dollars. And although $1 million or $3 million is not anything to sneeze at, there's a huge disparity in what we're seeing, you know, at the top and the bottom between male and female athletes. Predatory lending. There was an article recently discussing an athlete that signed an NIL deal while they were in college, but the deal was for them to provide a percentage of their earnings, you know, should they enter the NFL afterwards. And so it was an NIL deal that was structured based on them getting a lump sum now in exchange for, you know, part of their earnings if they were to enter the NFL. So we've got that being characterized now as, a loan type of transaction. We've got employment status. I know you guys have all seen in the news about whether student athletes are employees, or not employees. And now that we're adding NIL to the mix, what that does to that employee, non-employee question. Conference realignment, we're seeing that here in our own city. Conferences, we've got these super conferences developing, some say based on the NIL issue, right? We started to see a lot of movement once the NCAA changed their rules, and we are starting to see a lot of coalescing around these powerhouse schools that have the ability to offer larger deals. And there's so much more. So I write on this topic, and there's always something new. So it's it's very ripe for discussion, and I hope we can have some of that discussion. I just have on the screen here the various different articles that I do research on this frequently. Why federal regulation is needed for NIL. A lot of that is going on now, especially recently. We've got, the Title IX issue. Ever since NIL was, in its beginning stages, there were concerns about whether there would be a disparity between, male and female athletes as it relates to NIL. And we are seeing that, right? I mentioned earlier, when you look at the deals on the high end, we see a huge disparity between what the football, basketball, revenue generating sports players are getting as opposed to female athletes. And so there's been, especially, in my writing, some discussion of, how Title IX plays into that. I just mentioned the predatory lending. The Javon Dexter is what I was specifically talking about. He has filed a lawsuit now against the company that provided him with the NIL funds that were also taking a percentage of his earnings once he went pro. So you can see that in the news as well. And then we've got the student athlete employment issue. Oh my goodness, this is getting us set up for a circuit split, right? So we've got, currently one circuit saying that student athletes are not employees, and then potentially, just potentially, we might have another circuit ruling that they are employees, which would set us up for a Supreme Court decision. So that's going on in the news. Conference realignment. There's just so many issues surrounding NIL that are interesting and exciting and kind of life-changing, for both these student athletes and perhaps the schools as well, because they've never really had to deal with these types of issues before. Student athlete compensation, so to speak, had previously been cabined to tuition, room and board, and perhaps a small stipend. And now schools are having to contend with the transfer portal, NIL together, conference realignment, the athlete, employee, or student issues. So there's just a confluence of issues that are coming together at this time that are making it, a very exciting place for student athletes. Or unexciting place, probably from a school perspective, but these are very different times for intercollegiate athletics. And so my formal part of the presentation, ends here. And the rest of the time I would like to use for questions, comments, concerns. I always get a lot of good questions from this topic because there's just so much to talk about. So I will stop here. And if there are any questions, I would love to entertain them. Yes, thank you.
I'll admit to knowing very little about this subject, so this may be not the best question you ever get. But when I think about the specifically the female athletes on the lower end of the spectrum, where's most of their money coming from? Is it social media posts like Instagram, or I don't see them with the $13 million Adidas deals. And when I think I was looking at Olivia Dunn in one of your examples. Is there any sort of split in terms of someone's name, image, or likeness who is a student athlete but also has an Instagram brand or a social media brand? Does the law look at those two activities and those two images differently, or are they the same for purposes of NIL statutes?
Right. And so that's an excellent question. And so previously, student athletes had to be, very cautious about having separate social media because it was construed to be, one and the same. If you're a student athlete, your social media is automatically going to be imputed to be some sort of NIL activity before NIL activities were allowed, right?
And
So
that was then all covered by that. It was not, you couldn't make money off of it.
right, you
Okay.
couldn't make any, you weren't supposed to. Some students were able to get waivers, of course, but the vast majority were getting in trouble for having those types of things. But now, yes, you can have your private social media, you can make money off of that. You can also make money off of doing posts for companies now. And to your first question regarding whether the female athletes on the lower end, primarily what they're making the most money off of is social media activities. You know, they're making appearances as well, and some may be doing lessons, but where you're seeing, unless they've got a brand deal, right? If they're, you know, in the upper echelon, they've got a brand deal. Social media is where most of them are making their money. Excellent question.
So what is happening in those states where there isn't state NIL legislation?
Everything, right? And so in the states where there are no NIL laws, essentially they only really have two restrictions. Can't be used as a recruiting inducement, and we all know, you know, by its very nature, NIL is inducing some students, right? And then the second is it can't be, you know, direct pay for performance. And so those are essentially the only two rules that schools in those states with no NIL laws need to be mindful of. They don't have to worry about, you know, restrictions on facilitation unless there is some state law that applies, and all of these other restrictions of states that have, you know, specific laws that either allow or prohibit certain things. So it's wide open for those states that don't have those laws. Yes.
Who's looking out for the students?
That's
You know, they are the ones that will have the most risk with the contract arrangements that have to be so complicated that, you know, they could really be in trouble for the rest of their lives because of a contract that they sign in college that they have then no control over.
Yes, that is also an excellent question. So some of the states, when I talked about those one-off provisions, some of the states put restrictions on how long an NIL contract can endure. So I know in Florida, originally, the Florida statute said that the NIL contracts can only last as long as the college athletes' eligibility to play sports in college. But they repealed that section of the law. That was before, you know, the student that has filed a lawsuit was, you know, grandfathered in under the prior statute. But that was a safeguard. That was a guardrail, you know, originally. But not all states had that provision. And as I said, Florida has repealed it. So that could have been something. The agent provision, almost all of the NIL laws have the agent provision. So the student athletes are allowed to engage with agents. But again, most student athletes aren't making, you know, 6 figures, 7 figures, 8 figures. And so the cost benefit of having an attorney to assist you with your $100 deal, I'm not sure. So the agent, to answer your question, the agent was supposed to be somewhat of a safeguard in addition to those states that have limitations on the duration of the contracts.
Since they're being recruited, you have to be aware of all the states.
Right.
School they're considering.
Exactly.
Realities there.
So it's really a necessity to have some sort of someone to consult with. But right now, students are really left to figure that out on their own. Excellent question. I saw some hands here in the front. Oh, yes, John, do you have a question?
You showed the chart that over 4/5 of it are going to two sports. When you throw in women's basketball as well, that's great bulk. In the other section, are we seeing anything changing in the landscape? Are there schools using particular NIL packages to target, we want to be really great at polo, that sort of a thing, or is that just random?
So the schools aren't supposed to be that involved, right? But I guess, you know, behind the scenes, right, if there's a particular coach that wants a particular player in some of those Olympic sports, perhaps there could be some activity going on there. But by and large, the market is dictating what is kind of happening right now. And for the most part, basketball and football are the sports that are garnering the vast majority, unless, like you said, there's a particular school that is interested in being great in a particular non-basketball or football sport, and they're, you know, putting their resources behind making sure that those athletes receive deals as well.
So I think I heard you say something that I've been thinking a lot since I think I heard you said the term gentlemen's clubs. Is there any way that we're protecting our maybe mostly female athletes from a more gendered or sexualized approach to earning money in a way? It sounds really horrible. If I had a daughter who was an athlete right now, I wouldn't want my son athlete going to the either, but are we seeing any of that? Is anybody concerned about that?
Right. So, unfortunately, even outside of the gentlemen's club scenarios, when we do look at the types of activities that women athletes are doing that are making the most, they tend to be sort of sexualized, unfortunately. You see, swimsuits and various different types of suggestive industries, I guess. And so on that side, there's other than the vice industries prohibitions that again don't exist in all states, those would be the only safeguards for female athletes. And so yes, you are right. At the high end of the spectrum, we are kind of seeing a lot of that type of activity on the female side, unfortunately. Yes.
I have a question. You mentioned some of the language and some of the statutes and some relate to financial literacy.
Mm-hmm.
So my question, right, you already know I'm a contracts professor, right? So I'm looking at this, the incentivized performance. There is that restriction, but yet if any of these athletes become professional athletes, they will be paid for different advances in their, professional performance, right? So I'm always thinking about the financial literacy component to the extent to which the institutions care that students begin to learn how to be entrepreneurs of their own skills, right? To what, how broad is that financial literacy component to, how many states have that thought to provide that level of financial literacy or understanding that would help them address the issue of, understanding the contract or thinking about other ways they can make money for themselves. And the only reason I'm asking this is because as a parent of an elite athlete, one of the issues I always had going into college is what happens if there's an injury. To the extent to which I'm a proponent of NIL because in many schools, if an athlete is injured, they lose their scholarship. And in a way, the school has made their money off of the revenue generating activities that the student athlete is engaged in. But yet here is this injured athlete who loses their scholarship and their ability to continue their education. And in a way, the NIL compensation gives them a resource, right, to continue to move forward and perhaps gain some entrepreneurial heft moving forward. So I guess I'm thinking about that financial literacy component to it, and I want to know, how broad is that level of restriction in these types of rules?
Yes, I don't think the vast majority of states require that financial literacy training, but those that do, they can only go so far until they get into I'm not your attorney territory, kind of. And so they do provide, some things that you should look for. But as far as looking at specific contracts, I know that some schools have clinics that assist, some student athletes with those types of activities. But again, I don't think that's the general rule outside of providing, basic training. Oh, you should look for this in a contract. So schools are free to make various different policies regarding NIL, and some of these programs are occurring at the school policy level, regardless of whether the state law mandates it or not.
So I want to remind the virtual audience, if you have a question, just put it in the Q&A chat and we will look for your question.
Yes.
How has NIL impacted students' journeys to go pro, either positively or negatively? Because I have a personal experience. My boyfriend played baseball for NKU and now is in the process of going pro, and he never did NIL, but his other best friend did NIL. He went pro.
Okay. So I think, NIL is a self-regenerating sort of cycle, right? So you are attracting attention initially, probably before your sport because you're good. And then you get your first deals and it's giving you more publicity that's producing, more deals. I think another way, and this may not get at the gist of your question, I think another way that NIL is impacting athletes who go pro is their expectations regarding salary. So if you think about, if you've already been making seven figures as a student athlete, what does that do to your expectations when you do go pro? And what does that do to, perhaps teams that may not be able to meet those expectations? So I think, there's a trickle down impact or trickle up impact, right, of NIL into the professional league from that perspective as well. Excellent question.
Quick follow-up on that question, or kind of related. Is it too early to say, or do you know if NIL have any effect on what the one and done trend, which I guess is fairly prominent in basketball? Will student athletes stay a little longer now that they can make money in a high-profile program?
So another excellent question. So just anecdotally, they're saying that it is causing student athletes to stay in school longer, especially those that don't have, the most clear chance of going pro. If they're making, a substantial amount of money in college, it does kind of encourage them to stay there, provided that they're not in a sport where they're going to get injured, and that's not going to make good business sense. But from what I'm reading anecdotally, it is causing some student athletes to stay in school longer because, they weigh the costs and benefits.
So an NBA contract could be a multi-million-dollar thing, or what level of compensation is typical with NIL?
So typically student athletes, they're just making in the thousands, right? The 3,000, 4,000, 5,000, 6,000. When you start to get into the five figures, that's kind of a different level, and then you continue to ratchet up. But most students are making less than 10,000, and most are making in the $1,000 range with small deals with local companies or individuals.
Is there a concern in universities and colleges that, for instance, let's say at the University of Cincinnati, when I'm an athletic booster, there was parity among the sports. Mm-hmm. And now there is a really big push. We can take Cincy Reigns. It's very popular. We even have a beer marketed from Rheingeist that's helping to fund. I'm giving money here. I'm probably not giving money over here. And I don't know if anyone's thought of or how that's going to affect, because the NIL money is going to go primarily to the major men's players.
Right. That's another, you guys are fired tonight. Yeah, that's another concern. So when you have a booster, that is a direct affiliation to the school, and those funds kind of need to be distributed relatively evenly amongst the, at the end of the day, amongst the men's and women's programs. But with NIL, you're right. The marketplace kind of dictates where that money goes, and it primarily right now, as we can see, is going to men's basketball and football, to the exclusion of a lot of other sports, at least at that level, right? So I'm pretty sure.
Well, I think it speaks to, I know you keep saying it's restricted, that it's not a recruiting tool, but I think the boosters know it is.
Oh, absolutely. Absolutely.
And so there's a lot of money going into the collective.
Yes.
And that's probably going to be money not going into the regular athletic booster program.
Right. And additionally, another thing to think about, is even outside of, the athletics department, perhaps that $10 million donor may have donated to the chemistry department or some other department. So given the limitations on funds, perhaps there are various different areas that won't receive as much attention under NIL as they would have received under a different type of scenario.
Tan, you mentioned the transfer portal as one of the significant changes. What about the interaction between NIL and the transfer portal? Might a student at a college that's in a lesser market transfer to a greater market? Has there been any look at how these two things interact?
So I know the transfer portal is the bane of some coaches' existence just because now that the players don't have to wait, we've got, I don't want to say some shenanigans, but yeah, some shenanigans going where certain athletes are being enticed to enter the portal based on what they might potentially, of course, always potentially earn in NIL in a larger market, right? And so, yes, there is definitely some of that, or a lot of that rather, going on. We see a lot more movement now than we ever did before NIL became a thing. So I think it is causing, lots of destabilizing behaviors. Oh. Who'd like to
Jan,
go? Okay, go ahead.
the transferring of NIL, the realignment of conferences, and another factor that you mentioned, there are 4 factors that are colliding and having a material impact, results of which are unknown. If you were queen of the world and you wanted to implement a static solution, not an evolutionary one, what would you do?
Okay. Oh, goodness. All right.
And as queen of the world, you have total power,
Total power.
whether you want it or not.
Okay. Let's see. Let me think about this for a few seconds here. Okay, so the first thing I think that I would do would be we do need a national standard. I think it's unworkable to, have to put the burden on student athletes to have to figure out, okay, if I want to go to North Carolina, there's this set of incentives. If I want to go to California, maybe there's not as many. So I think we do need like a level playing field regarding the core of what students are looking at regarding the law itself. I think secondarily, I really think that initially it would have been a better idea for schools to have NIL in-house as opposed to having all of these sometimes unsavory third-party players coming in and filling that void with it being such a new sort of benefit for students. And so I think if there could be a scenario whereby the students could receive more guidance or assistance from their schools, I think that would be a more ideal scenario than what we have now, where you just have student athletes, out on their own, doing all these various different things with third parties that that don't have a long history, especially as it relates to collectives, because some of them were just came up last year. So I think there needs to be a little bit more coordination between the student athletes and the schools regarding these types of activities. I don't know if there should be caps or what have you, but definitely more of a coordinated effort between the student athletes and the school so that we don't have third parties dictating what's happening at various different institutions.
Among the states who have passed additional laws on top of just, I guess, school regulations of these NIL deals, what are some commonalities?
So additional laws regarding
like NIL deals and regarding like the students and what they can and cannot take on.
So, for example, the vice industries and the use of logos are things that I see. There's restrictions on the use of, facilities and uniforms. Some schools want the student athletes to use their logos and facilities, and some are just adamantly opposed to that just because they're not controlling the types of things that they're doing. So those are the things that I'm seeing like a lot more in the news regarding those types of things, the use of school assets and the regulation of vice industries and things. Because, these are institutions of higher education and there's certain things that they may not want their brand associated with.
So I'm going to ask a Title IX question. So Title IX has rules around dollars that a university can support and how much is used on either side. But this weekend, a football game I'm watching, a football player with a big deal, an NIL deal, was then buying all of his friends on the football team all of his stuff, which then creates a completely unequal playing field for the women teams, even though the university itself isn't the one. So who's going to control that playing field if the players themselves are using their NIL money to create a money, like field for men and women.
Right. I feel like, once the cat is out of the bag and the bag has been transferred to the player, there's not much that can be done. I really do think that, there needs to be some sort of at the school level, first at the national level, so we have that playing field to know what the rules are. And then once we figure that out, I think definitely some coordination at the school level so you don't see those sort of circumstances where it looks like the men's sports are just getting every single possible benefit ever. And the school is involved in that because we know that they're involved with the collectives, right? There's not an 8-figure deal that a coach probably didn't know about in advance. And so because we've got this such a close relationship already, I just think we need to, just like we took, those undercover payments and brought them above the table with NIL, we might need to take some of these undercover relationships and bring them above the table so that we can kind of coordinate a little bit better.
And there have been a couple of, some discussion tonight of the potential value of a national standard. And we have a question from the virtual audience that's a little related to that. Having different NIL laws from state to state, has that ever affected an athlete's ability to perform their contractual obligations?
Has it ever affected? Now, I'm not aware of any specific athletes scenario, but if it's one of the larger deals, those types of student athletes are working with agents and they've probably been advised to go to one state over another based on the regulation. So I don't know at the smaller deal level whether that's having an impact on their compliance. But what is supposed to be happening is that companies or individuals in those states are supposed to know what the laws are themselves, and not act outside of those. But at the higher level, for sure, those athletes are advised about which states are going to provide better deals for them.
Your answer suggests a follow-up, if I may. Agents. Is there an industry of college-oriented agents that's emerging in the marketplace because of NIL?
Yes, I'm starting to see some of that, and that is also, an issue in and of itself because you've got, agents now kind of operating outside of the infrastructure that was originally in place before NIL became a thing. So yes, we are seeing a new type of agent specializing in NIL.
We have any more questions from the audience?
So you've talked a lot about kind of this back and forth between the states and the NCAA. A lot of it stemming from the antitrust challenges related to Alston. Do you think moving forward is kind of they keep that antitrust threat of litigation in their back pocket? Do you think national legislation would be affected if there wasn't an antitrust exemption in it? I know some of the proposals so far have had that in it and some haven't.
I am not sure if there, and this is going beyond the subject of your question. I am not sure if there is an appetite to necessarily protect a billion-dollar industry from competition. So I don't know if the antitrust exemption would be successful, as opposed to just like laying a common foundation for the law. I'm not sure if, I don't know if that would be successful, under this type of scenario, right? So we've got a billion-dollar industry that a lot of people feel, or at least felt before NIL, was kind of exploiting student athletes at some level. So I'm not sure if there is an appetite in Congress to provide the antitrust exemption, because that was the first solution that the NCAA was seeking, right? That's what they wanted when California passed their law initially. And that would have been, at the time, the simpler solution for Congress to just give them an antitrust exemption. And so I don't think there was an appetite for that. And I'm not sure, now that we see all of, what's happening, I'm not sure if there's an appetite for that now either. But great question.
In the current attempts to try to get national legislation, what has been the pitfalls then?
Oh my goodness.
Money's probably one.
I'm really baffled, right? The states have an interest in having a uniform law as well. I just think there's not an appetite to assist the billion-dollar organization with their money problems right now. I think there's so much more going on in the country. It's just not that high of a priority. That's what just my thoughts.
Plus, the people who are boosters at a university could be the same people that are contributors to political
Yes,
politicians.
exactly.
So they're driving their alma mater to success at whatever school it is, as opposed to something that's good for the general student population.
Right. Yeah, I'm really baffled. There's been a dozen pieces of legislation and just none of them, they've been ranging the gamut from, very restrictive to very liberal, and just none of them have gotten any traction at all. So I just think there's just, at this moment in time, there's not enough of an existential crisis to warrant Congress to intervene in this, billion-dollar first world problem.
Tan, we're gonna if I could just ask one last question, and then we'll watch, learn a little Reds history and go root for a victory. But I don't know if I can pin you down on this or not, because but overall, is NIL good, bad, or just pros and cons?
Wow. Overall. I think it can be good. So when NIL first came out, I thought, oh man, this is really going to be good for all the sports. Women's sports are going to benefit, men's sports are going to benefit. Everybody's going to get something from this situation. And then we see the statistics, right? And we see that, everyone is not getting the same level of something. So I think it has potential to be good, but I don't know if we're past the point where we could make NIL realize that potential. Perhaps we might be too far gone, but it has the potential to be good, right? It's causing some students to stay in school a little bit longer. Of course, we have students that are coming from, impoverished circumstances, and now they're able to both, feed themselves and their families. So there's lots of pros, but I think the way that it's been operationalized has caused, a tremendous number of issues that now we think, some people will think that, it's all bad, but I think it really did have the potential to be good. And it might still have that potential if we can get, a hold on some of the issues that keep popping up, like daily, it appears.
Well, thank you. Please join me in thanking.
Thank you. Thank you all for joining us this evening. And I hope you will tour the Hall of Fame and stay after for the game.
And we have a little Reds history for you, and see you on October the 11th at Cincinnati Observatory.
Since 1869, almost 2,000 players have worn the uniform of the Cincinnati Reds. While each of these players has made his own unique contribution to the history of the team, it has been a relative few whose contributions have made the team's history truly great. These are the record breakers and difference makers, the creators of indelible memories, and the winners of championships. For a city whose bond with its team transcends mere affection and loyalty, they shine like jewels in the city's crown. They are kings of the Queen City. The history of Reds baseball is almost as old as the city itself. Settled in 1788 on the banks of the Ohio River, by the time baseball's first all-professional team, the Cincinnati Red Stockings, took the field in 1869, Cincinnati had become one of the nation's largest cities and was known throughout the country as the Queen City of the West. The fabled Red Stockings were a phenomenon, playing their entire 1869 schedule without suffering a defeat, a streak that extended into the middle of the 1870 campaign. The first official championship won by a Reds team occurred in 1882, when the Reds captured the American Association pennant in the first year of that major league's existence. The 1882 Reds featured all-time great Bid McPhee at second base and pitcher Will White, who won 40 games for the pennant-winning Reds. 8 years after capturing the franchise's first pennant, the Reds moved to the more established National League. Soon after, stars like outfielder Cy Seymour and pitcher Noodles Hahn made their marks on the game. In 1919, the Reds claimed their first world title by defeating the White Sox in the World Series. While controversy will forever surround the victory due to the 8 White Sox players later found guilty of conspiring to lose the series, there is no controversy about the greatness of the 1919 Reds. Led by superstar center fielder Ed Roush, third baseman Heine Groh, and the league's best pitching staff, the 1919 Reds' .686 winning percentage remains the best of any Reds team in history. The great pitching that propelled the Reds to the 1919 championship remained a hallmark of the team for most of the next decade, as the club's all-time career wins leader, Epirixie, teamed with Pete Donahue and Dolph Luke to form one of baseball's most formidable starting trios. Despite the great pitching talent of the 1920s Reds, it would be a new group of players who would lead the team back to the postseason a decade later. The Reds' resurgence began in 1938 under new manager Bill McKechnie. Under the Deacons' watch, young lefty Johnny Vandermeer pitched 2 no-hitters in successive starts, setting a record that will likely never be broken. Behind the plate for each of Vandy's gems was Ernie Lombardi, who that season won the league's batting title and became the first Red to be named the National League's most valuable player. The Reds were a good team in 1938. In 1939, they became a great team. The Reds raced to the pennant behind the pitching excellence of Bucky Walters and Paul Derringer, baseball's best starting duo. Derringer won 25 games, and Walters won the pitching Triple Crown, leading the league in wins, strikeouts, and ERA. Performance that earned him league MVP honors. A humbling loss to the Yankees in the World Series was all but forgotten in the wake of the Reds' victory over the Tigers in the 1940 Fall Classic. Walters and Derringer again led the way, while first baseman Frank McCormick became the 3rd consecutive Red to be named the National League's most valuable player. The ensuing decades were filled with outstanding individual performances and memorable clubs. In 1944, 15-year-old Joe Nuxall became the youngest player to ever appear in a major league game, as the Hamilton, Ohio schoolboy took the mound for a relief appearance on June 15. In 1947, it was Ewell Blackwell who forever etched his name in the annals of Reds history. The Whip reeled off 16 consecutive victories en route to a league-leading 22, and came within 2 outs of duplicating Johnny Vandermeer's feat of throwing consecutive no-hitters. In 1956, the Reds blasted a then Major League record 221 home runs, as fan favorites Ted Kluszewski, Wally Post, Gus Bell, Ed Bailey, and rookie Frank Robinson formed the nucleus of baseball's most powerful lineup. In 1961, the Ragamuffin Reds, led by manager Fred Hutchinson, shocked the baseball world by winning the National League pennant. Featuring the MVP performance of Frank Robinson, the 1961 Reds also boasted one of baseball's best pitching staffs, headlined by the Big Three starting trio of Joey J., Bob Perkey, and Jim O'Toole. The 1960s also saw the rise of Jim Maloney to the ranks of baseball's elite pitchers, as the hard-throwing right-hander tossed 2 no-hitters and set the franchise record for career strikeouts. Perhaps the greatest legacy of the 1960s was the emergence of Pete Rose, Tony Perez, and Johnny Bench, 3 of the players who formed the core of the Big Red Machine team that would dominate baseball in the 1970s. Led by manager Sparky Anderson, the Big Red Machine won 2 World Series, 4 pennants, and 5 division titles from 1970 to 1978. Reds players won an incredible 6 of 9 league MVP awards during this period. After falling short in the World Series in 1970 and again in 1972, the Machine reached baseball's pinnacle in 1975. With all its pistons firing, the Reds won a franchise record 108 regular season games and defeated the Red Sox in one of the most memorable World Series ever played. The Reds repeated as champions in 1976, in the process becoming the first team in baseball history to sweep both the league playoffs and World Series.
This could be it. Left field. George Foster makes the catch. That's it. The Cincinnati Reds win the World Series in 4 straight. It was a sweep, and the Reds' 7-game sweep in postseason play. Their first team to do that.
Big Red Machine's back-to-back world championships represent the unquestioned apex of Reds history. While no decade has yet to surpass the 1970s in collective or individual achievement, the decades that have followed have treated Reds fans to a host of memories. There was the 1981 season when a players' strike split the season in two, and despite posting baseball's best overall record, the Reds were denied a playoff berth because they did not finish in first place in either of that season's halves. On September 11, 1985, Reds fans rejoiced in the crowning of Cincinnati's own Pete Rose as baseball's hit king, as Pete singled to pass Ty Cobb on the all-time hits list.
He levels the bat a couple of times. Shao kicks and he fires. Rose swings. Hit number 41-2. A line drive single into left center field, a clean base hit. There's pandemonium here at Riverfront Stadium.
In 1987, Reds fans were witness to the blossoming of Eric Davis into one of the most talented players in baseball, as Eric the Red became the first Red to hit more than 30 home runs and steal more than 30 bases in the same season. The next year, Tom Browning became the first pitcher in Reds history to throw a perfect game.
And Tom Browning has pitched a perfect game. 27 outs in a row. A perfect game thrown by Tom Browning on this Friday night, September the 16th, 1988, as he no-hits the Los Angeles Dodgers 1-0 and throws the first perfect game in the long and legendary history of this great Cincinnati Reds baseball franchise.
The 1990s began with the franchise's fifth world championship, as the Reds remained in first place each day of the season, defeated the Pirates in the playoffs, and swept the heavily favored A's in the World Series. The Reds returned to the postseason in 1995, propelled by the incomparable play of shortstop Barry Larkin, whose multifaceted gifts were rewarded with the league's Most Valuable Player award. Almost unbelievably, Larkin followed up his MVP campaign in 1996 by becoming the first shortstop to join baseball's exclusive 30-30 club. In 1999, the Reds made another run for the postseason, winning 96 games before losing to the Mets in a memorable one-game tiebreaker. Sterling performances and unforgettable moments have continued to unfold in the 21st century. Reds fans witnessed the opening of Great American Ballpark, the Reds' first baseball-only home since they last played at Crosley Field in 1970. As the new century progressed, fans followed Cincinnati's own Ken Griffey Jr.'s pursuit for his milestone 500th and 600th home runs. And in 2010, Reds fans reveled in their team's return to the postseason as a club led by NL MVP Joey Votto, second baseman Brandon Phillips, right fielder Jay Bruce, and ace pitcher Johnny Cueto won the National League Central Division.
So here's Burdick and here's Bruce. And a high fly ball, center field. He hit it a ton. It's gone. And the 2010 Central Division Championship belongs to the Cincinnati Reds.
Reds won the division again in 2012 and were playoff qualifiers in 2013. The run of 3 postseason appearances in 4 years is a first for the Reds since the Big Red Machine era. While much has changed since that first Reds team took the field in 1869, one constant has remained. Then as now, the Reds have always captivated their hometown. Their successes become touchstones against which time is measured and generations are defined. The very best of the Reds, the star players and great teams are joined together in collective memory like the great monarchies of history. For Reds fans, they are baseball royalty. They are kings of the Queen City.